That's right. So I think that what you were describing as, did you say for public?
Yeah, for public
public
consumption. Yeah.
Yeah, what you're calling for public consumption is what I call the political grammar.
Right.
Right? There are certain things that you have to say in public. You just have no choice.
Even if you absolutely positively don't believe it, which is why you always have to watch what politicians do, not what they say.
Thank you. That's exactly what I believe. And so in order to do proper geopolitical analysis, you have to analyze where the people who make state-level decisions are spending billions of dollars, because those are the things they really care about. Their public statements are almost completely useless as sources of information about their goals, values, intentions, and so forth.
If we look at that whole issue of, say, surrendering territory, we are now in the very same situation. You have President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry here trying to basically push Israel back to the pre-June 67 borders. You'll hear comments regurgitated frequently that say, for example, these settlements in the West Bank or in parts of Jerusalem are illegal under international law, when in reality no such law exists.
Correct.
But you keep hearing this. We are now pushing them back to a place where they can't sustain themselves. You and I both understand this. Look at this latest round of nonsense that came out where the only people who really got ahead were the Iranians. And of course we've just put that off to another day when we're supposed to have more negotiations and hardball terms of the treaties. But at the very same time, we already know from treaties with North Korea that those don't work. So you have to ask yourself, if what is logical is not happening, then there is some other agenda afoot. So where are we headed today, then, with Israel?
Oh, genocide, of course. The Israeli Jewish people will be exterminated.
That's the goal thereof.
Yes, I can see no other plausible explanation for what they're doing. The Iranian ruling elite announced in public that their intention was genocide. And what is the most important policy of the United States around Iran's borders? Well, it was the invasion of Iraq, wasn't it? And what was the consequence of invading Iraq and then pulling out? The consequence was that a Shia-dominated government run from Iran now rules Iraq. So Iraq was turned into Iran's westernmost province thanks to the spending of billions of US dollars. And now the US government is making things easy for Iran, for them to develop nuclear weaponry, now that they have approximated the border of Iran to within a few miles of Israel. And this, by the way, is perfectly consistent with the history of US foreign policy towards Iran. On HIR, we have an investigation that spans 30 years of U.S. foreign policy towards Iran, and it is remarkably consistent. So even as the ruling elites in both of these countries are constantly exchanging insults, the actual policies that are followed by the United States are invariably of the sort to strengthen the geopolitical position of Iran vis-a-vis its neighbors.
Yeah, it is interesting you say that, because remember we had here in the United States, we had 9/11, and as we've been attacked by Al-Qaeda, let's go attack Iraq. And I put up a little flag. I said, doesn't anybody catch the non sequitur here? Iraq didn't attack us. What's the deal here? Something's covering up.
Yes, I think that's a good point. But it's important to put it in historical context, because before they invaded Iraq, there was a policy called containment of Iraq,
right,
which was put in place by the Clinton administration. And the consequence of that policy was tremendously weaken Iraq. Now, before that, there was a policy called the Gulf War, which was put in place by Bush. So there is a very consistent pattern of weakening the Iraqis vis-a-vis the Iranians. Before the Gulf War, there was a policy called Iran-Contra, which lasted the entire decade of the 80s. And that was put in place by Reagan. And Reagan put in place the Iran-Contra policy, which was a policy to send billions of dollars to the Iranians in secret so that they could defeat the Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq war. And what about before that? Well, before that, you had the policy of paying billions of dollars for the release of the hostages at the American embassy in Tehran. So if you look at the 30 years of U.S. ruling elite policy towards Iran, all you can see when you look at the money flows and the flows of weapons is dramatic, consistent support Iran against Iraq. And this is very important because the big rivalry in Western Asia between Iraq and Iran had geopolitical meaning. It wasn't just in cultural and religious meaning. It wasn't just a simple fight. Iraq represented secular government for Muslims. Yes, it wasn't the nicest government in the world. It was certainly an authoritarian, more or less totalitarian, fascist government. But it was not a theocratic Muslim government. Women could get an education. They didn't have to go back and forth covered up like they were in the Middle Ages. There were important social services spent on and so forth. Whereas the Iranian model is the theocratic fascist model, where they're also fascists, but in addition, they are Islamist fascists, which therefore practice Sharia, which literally enslaves the population and especially women. So what was in play in the great rivalry between Iraq and Iran was which model was going to win, whether a medieval theocratic Islamist model or a not very nice, but at least secularized and modern bureaucratic model. And what the U.S. ruling elite did over and over again is it spent billions of dollars making sure that the Iranian model became ascendant.
Where do you think the global elite, per se, are taking us right now with all of this? If I'm watching what's coming out of the international economic order, we're really moving almost into another form of feudalism again. You can see this, where you made a comment earlier on that they always have to speak as if they are concerned about the public and the welfare of the public. But, say, for example, here in this country, the Obama administration has been talking about the need to create jobs, and yet the policies and the laws that they're passing, Congress is passing the laws and the policies of the administration, are actually scaring companies out of hiring people. They've created this atmosphere of almost paranoia because of the tax situation in which the companies are just saying, we're just not going to hire until we know what these rules are. And they've kept it in constant instability. So again, you have the public pronouncement versus what's actually going on.
Well, I don't know if feudalism is the right word, because feudalism is a spent model. I don't believe the people who run the world want an actual feudal model. I believe they want something more like Nazi Germany or Maoist China or something like that, which are not feudal states. They're actually modern forms of totalitarian control. I can't comment too much on the economic strategies that they're following because I'm not really equipped to understand them. It's not really my area. But what I can tell you is that what comes out of my geopolitical analysis is that, or at least in the interpretation I give to what has been going on, is that the ruling elites of the Western world are trying to defeat the consequences of the French Revolution. So once the French Revolution succeeded, and it didn't really succeed in 1789, it succeeded in 1848, which is the European Spring. 1848 is the year that Western peoples, all over Western civilization, rose simultaneously in arms to demand constitutions, parliaments, elections, liberal laws, and so forth. And it was that dramatic moment of everybody taking to the streets at the same time. It was really unbelievable. Only the British Isles, not the colonies, and the Russian Empire were spared. Everything else was burning. And this is the moment that the ruling elites realized that they could not go back to the feudal Middle Ages. And they started granting constitutions and parliaments and elections and so forth, because they didn't want to see their heads roll. But soon after this, and this, by the way, is the real birth of the modern world, the world that we're still in. Soon after 1848, the eugenics movement, and the point of the eugenics movement and the fascist movements, which they were also invented right after this, was to create political and pseudoscientific structures that would allow the ruling elites to start destroying the liberal legacy of the French Revolution that midwifed the modern world. So I believe this is what's going on, and I believe that's what World War II was about. It was a major attempt to destroy the liberal legacy of the French Revolution and take us into a truly modern form of barbarism and slavery that wouldn't look too much like the feudal Middle Ages, but would achieve the same political end result of re-enslaving the middle classes and the lower classes of Western society.
You know, we're just about out of time here. I was going to ask you about your ideas. If we took your ideas right now and projected them forward as far as the peace process that's going on, I'll put that in quotes, by the way, and also where things will head with Iran, what would you expect to see if we take your model and run it forward?
Well, if you run it forward, assuming that Westerners don't wake up in time, you should see Europe reach a Muslim critical mass, The ruling elites in Europe have been encouraging the growth of Islam in Europe, and they don't have to become a majority, they just need to become a critical mass for the system to tip in favor of a Muslim-dominated Europe. And that's, according to some demographers, not too far away. So you should see that. You should see a genocide in Israel and the growth of a unified sort of Muslim political order taking place, an emerging caliphate, and the complete destruction of what's left of the liberal tradition in the West. You should see a more rapid encroaching on what remains of our civil and political liberties in the years ahead. So this is why my book is called The Collapse of the West, the Next Holocaust and Its Consequences. The book identifies a pattern in the last 2,500 years where you can see that every time there is a major persecution of the Jewish people, and another one is coming, there is a collapse of liberties and protections for ordinary people everywhere. So the dramatic example that we have in recent memory is the Nazi genocide. Yes, the German Nazis murdered between 5 and 6 million Jews in Europe, but let's not forget that more than 54 million non-Jews also lost their lives. And beyond those 54 million who died, there are countless millions of others who lost all of their liberties, even though they were not killed. So there is a very strong correlation between persecution and death for the Jewish people and a complete collapse of liberty and the general welfare for everybody else. If we want to stop this from happening again, we should do what we didn't do in the 20s and 30s, which is to rise up against anti-Semitism fast, authoritatively, decisively, and join with the Jewish people to defend what remains of the Western liberal tradition. If we do what we did in the 20s and 30s, which is join with the anti-Semites, we will once again destroy ourselves as we did last time around.
Francisco Gil White, Professor Gil White, appreciate your time on this. Boy, there's so much we opened up here in terms of conversation and a cross-exam we could have done, but we ran out of time on a lot of this. Your website is hirhome.com, hirhome.com, and we appreciate your time. We'll have you back here on the show. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela justified a car bomb attack perpetrated by the African National Congress in May of 1983, which killed 19 people and wounded over 200, including many innocent civilians, asserting that such accidents were the inevitable consequence of the decision to embark on a military struggle. In the days to come, illusion will probably be king, but it's reality that's going to take the day. Do remember to pray for us for provision and protection. Pray for those suffering for their faith around the world. Pray for those in charge of your own particular government. Lord willing, we'll see you next week. We're at steelon.steel.com. I'm John Loeffler, and the program is Steel on Steel.
This has been Steel on Steel with John Loeffler, an alternative information source for politics, religion, and global events. Steel on Steel is produced by Carol Loeffler, engineered by Glenn Meyer. The views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily those of the staff, management, owners, or advertisers of this radio station. Steel on Steel can be heard 24 hours a day on the internet at steelonsteel.com. Tapes or online subscriptions support the ongoing program production. For more information, call toll-free 1-800-829-5646. That's 1-800-829-5646. This is the Steel on Steel Radio Consortium.